Good evening to our webinar on development cooperation after USAID Perspectives from the Global South. Great to see so many colleagues and friends from around the world. My name is Stefan Klingebiel from IDOS in Bonn. 2 weeks back, we had great discussions with our group of NEST institutions, the network of southern think tanks from China, India, South Africa, and Brazil, plus IDOS in China, in Yunnan province, on current challenges, challenges to development cooperation. And of course, we saw all those existing dynamics over the last couple of years, but we all understand that Trump's return to the White House is a game changer in many regards. It's a game changer for US development cooperation. It's a game changer for global development cooperation, looking at many new announced cuts by UK, Netherlands, etc. It's a game changer for international relations. We all know that the Trump administration announced this 180-day review process if the US wants to stay in international organizations. So when we met in China, we agreed that we want to reflect jointly on with this group on where are we right now when it comes to development cooperation. So we have a group of great panelists with us today. Let me just start from the east, or from my point of view, what the East is. This is China, Professor Li Xiaoying. He is the chair professor and honorary dean of the College of International Development and Global Agriculture at China Agricultural University in Beijing. And he's also the chairman of NEST. We have Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. He's director general at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RS, in Delhi, India, and also member secretariat of NEST. We have Dr. Elizabeth Sideropoulos. She is CEO of the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIA. And we have Dr. André de Meo Sousa. He's director of Department of International Studies, Political and Economic Relations at the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. So I think we really have a well-known academics, experts in this field. Before I would like to hand over to the first panelist, a few housekeeping things. You might raise questions in the chat box. We have a large number of people joining us, so we are not opening the channel for everybody, but please provide your comments, provide your questions, and we are trying to identify some, and our panelists will respond to it. And the second one is we have 60 minutes, so this is not a lot of time with great panelists, so I will be strict with timekeeping. My dear friends and colleagues from the NEST group, they know it. German timekeeping will be very strict. So with this, I would like to start the first round, and with the question, what do you think are general implications of the dismantling of US development cooperation, dismantling of USAID for countries in the Global South? What might be challenges arising from this situation? But is there even any kind of positive aspect related to it? So any general reflection, and we would start with Professor Li. Professor Li, over to you, 2 to maximum 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen, and extremely delighted to join this panelist discussion at this very important point that within our community globally. So we've been discussing these issues that I'm not going to say dismantling, I'm not going to see anything shut down of the USAID and from US side, and but certainly So what happened since the Trump administration, second administration, and did in terms of its own administration and also the turning point of USAID. So I like make a very brief and very quick reflection generally. So number one, and I see the two dimension of implications. Number one is geopolitical impact since the USAID and since the aid provided by the US has been very important geopolitical instrument for US over the world, particularly over the global south. Therefore, any significant change, its structure, its volume provided, will have certainly a significant impact on the geopolitical, particularly on the global south. So this is number one I like to see. And the second dimension, I have to see the developmentally. And in addition to the geopolitical impact and the change of USAID certainly will have an impact on the development sector, which has been set up, which has been developed over last 60 years since the Second World War. So in terms of structure, in terms of architecture, in terms of rationality, and in terms of conduct, modality, everything. So those things, of course, it's not, we can't just take this, all this we have developed as the result of the US aid itself, but the US, itself, US aid system has played, significant role for that. So I would say, and that impact will probably lead to the reshaping the whole structure and the whole architecture, which we will see. This is something which I can see. And secondly, and the challenge, I would see the three major challenges I can see. First, number one is the resource decline, and the US shares significant proportion of the resources in terms, not only in terms of bilateral, but also multilateral and also other sources. So this is ODA based development resources. I can see clearly, and more I worry mostly is that many other countries will follow that, and many countries will follow that one. So that is really the risk. We need resources to really cope with the challenge, common challenge, climate change and everything. So that is something which I can see the challenge immediately. And the second one, and I see the increasing tendency of the tied to the national interest. And that's something which we have been working, and the development sector and the expert, everything will be working to de-link as much as possible to look really global, global vision and provided by the global public good. So the impact of this one will have a significant effect on the provision of global public good. So that is increasing tendency to try tied to the national interest. And also third one is I am not going to say definitely, but I see the possible collapse of developing the landscape. We get used, we've been actually depending on this to provide this global public good. So I would say the challenges, three challenges. So the positives briefly, and I would say number one, and this war and many southern countries and many countries from global south, and they will take quite clearly, they will take lesson to say, look, we have to strengthen our own development resources for our own, and we cannot really. So positively, in the future, development globally will have a kind of tendency to reduce the aid dependency issues. That is one positive. I would say the positive, and this will actually help to consolidate national resources, domestic resources, and that is one dimension. Now, secondly, I can see clearly that the role of social cooperation there will be will be will be will be seen as very important. I will not say the social cooperation will replace eventually the existing North-South and the whole structure, but I would see the increasing role of the social cooperation in the future. And this also push positively. This will provide opportunity for countries like China and India and South Africa and many other countries, even very small countries, they also provide development cooperation resources. And those countries will see and how we are going to work with existing partners like European Union and other countries, and the development sector is still there, but subject to change in the future. So I would like to take this very shortly. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your moderation. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Great reflections. I would love to raise more questions, to put more questions to you, but time is really running, and we will get back to some aspects later on. Before I hand over to Professor Chaturvedi, let me just encourage participants again to use the chat function, the general chat function, not just to me. I saw some of them. But we have a chance that all of us can read it. So with the same question, Professor Chaturvedi, what do you think might be implications for the global south as such? Over to you, Sachin.
Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. And let me once again welcome all the participants today who have joined us in sort of new series that we have begun from NEST. So my word of welcome for everybody, and we promise to remain active now on this front, and this series would continue over next few weeks. I have 3 points, Stefan, which I want to make. First and foremost is the magnitude that USAID brings on table, and we should not underestimate that. For more than 2 decades, US has been contributing more than 30% of the global ODA flows. US has been world's largest provider of development assistance. And almost of this $72 billion that US provides as ODA, almost 61% of this comes to developing countries or the global south through USAID. So USAID has that kind of sort of position to determine a large amount of global flows on development assistance. But USAID is not the only entity that gives development assistance. There are 10 other arms of United States administration which are also giving assistance, but the share of USAID is almost 60%, followed by Department of State, where the Department of State gives directly, which is almost 21%, and then you have Department of Treasury, which gives around 3%, Department of Health and Human Resources 2%, Millennium Challenge Corporation 1%. Rest then are below 0.123, like that. So these top 4 agencies, USAID is the top one. So that's the first point that I want to make, Stefan, that out of the global flows, US is the biggest donor, and within the US ecosystem, USAID is the biggest one. So this is perfectly well placed, and it's a big blow in terms of the resource flows. And time and again, every day in our social media, we are getting the details in terms of how many people are becoming unemployed, what is happening to development projects in the health sector and in many other areas where this is going haywire. So that's my first point. And I fully agree with what Professor Li Xiaoyin has said. And I want to bring that point in terms of the importance that it has for the developing countries or the global South's requirement. But then the question is, global South also has to take a step back and imagine, why do we need ODA? And here, a very conscientious decision making in terms of ability to do local resource mobilization, is extremely important. We mobilizing local resources for development purposes and do not become ODA dependent is something which is important. For last 6 years, USAID has been talking about self-reliance. In fact, if you see 2018, for the first time, USAID had brought out a document called Self-Reliance Through Development Partnership. And since then, they have been talking about it. And I think time has come for the Global South to revisit the development assistance portfolio to see how much of development cooperation and partnership they can bring in. And this, I think, brings me to my third point, Stefan, which is equally important for us to see the downside of it. Why President Trump has taken this decision that he has taken. Because the amount of leveraging that the functionaries of USAID did in terms of creating disruptive forces and partnership with them to topple governments, to encourage corruption, and to bring down democratically elected governments is something where USAID's role is becoming more and more evident with the kind of papers that are tumbling out from the cupboards of the investigative agencies. In our own neighborhood in South Asia, we are seeing this, and I think it should give us reasons to see the bandwidth of such agencies which have so many resources. On one hand, the excellent work that USAID has done in health sector, that it has contributed in terms of the public infrastructure. It's important, extremely important for the Global South. But then these are the downsides which are also coming out. And that's where I think a greater conversation between Global South and Global North is required in terms of why some good features of South-South cooperation, Buenos Aires Development Agenda, BAPA plus 40 agenda, is not being considered by the OECD DAC members. The idea of TOSD came up, but the important feature of the South-South cooperation and the promises that we make in terms of demand-driven nature of development assistance, why Global North is not absorbing the features of the Global South. And number one there is demand-driven development assistance. And this would address n number of leakages and counter operations that USAID functionaries were running. All this while, it would get adequately institutionally addressed. The second point, Stefan, is to see how do we bring in greater transparency. North and the OECD DAC have been pressing for transparency and accountability. And look at this. What was happening? Who was accountable and who was transparent? These questions are looking at us now, where South-South cooperation, Global South cooperation, is something that NEST, the network of Southern think tanks, has been talking about. We have been evolving our own framework, and I'm sure with entities like the UN Office on South-South Cooperation, with the South Center, we would be able to bring in greater gravitas to some of these issues which are important. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Professor Chaturvedi. Very important points, not at least on impact of USAID on governance systems in partner countries. I agree, we should discuss this to a larger extent. I would also love to get back to you later on the geopolitical impact of what we see in the US. Maybe I will ask you later on this again. So thank you. Let's turn to Dr. Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. Elizabeth, over to you. General implications of what we see in the development sector in the US on the Global South, countries in the Global South. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Stefan, and good to be with you all on this, to have a very important discussion. I am currently in Cape Town at the Finance in Common summit set of meetings where the discussions are obviously focusing on how we can leverage more finance in this rather fraught and challenged political and geopolitical environment for development, really leveraging not just the big multilateral development banks, obviously, but the smaller national development banks and even subnational actors. And that potentially is one dimension of the conversation that probably also needs to come here. But maybe let me touch on 3 or 4 points. Some of them have already been alluded to in the earlier points. But let me make the first point that I think you also referred to, Stefan. There will be a domino effect. We're already seeing the domino effect. I see in the comments in the chat, you know, the people sort of recording what has happened in the last couple of weeks in other development agencies in other countries around the world. And of course that, or in the global north. And of course that is also linked to the position that the US has taken on how it's going to engage on the war in Ukraine. And so a lot of invariably concern in Europe and divergence, diverting of budgets to fund defense activities. And so that's the first point. The second point, which is linked to the point around the observation around national interest, is that, of course, at a US level, it erodes its soft power significantly. And it also undermines trust. And trust, we all know, is an extremely difficult thing to build up. It's very easy to destroy, but then it's very difficult to build back up again. And I think in the same way, but in a much more acute way than other countries who sort of folded in their development programs into foreign ministries and so on. I think this is having a significant impact on the soft power, and it's bringing home that, you know, the discussions we had 20 years ago, and I'm mindful of 2005 was the Paris principles. What were they called on aid effectiveness? God, I mean, it seems like a whole epoch away and ago. All of those normative initiatives that you know, included country ownership and greater transparency and so on and so forth. That, you know, if it had already eroded, I think we can now read the final rights on that. And perhaps I'm being a little too cynical and a little too depressed, but I think the normative elements of aid, you know, the disguise has fallen. Okay, and I think this is now very much about national interest, and we're going to see that, I think, in other geographies as well. The fourth point, if those were the first 3 points, soft power, national interest, domino effect, the fourth point is really about the issue of democracy support. And notwithstanding, you know, areas where one can critique the way in which democracy support was carried out, I can certainly say in many parts of the African continent, the support of agencies like USAID and, in fact, other actors from Europe played a very important role in supporting civil society organizations over the last 20, 30 years, at a time when those countries were also building up more democratic polities. And we know the importance of civil society in pushing back and creating a space for dialogue and for accountability. Now, that's not to say there aren't bad apples, but I think certainly in an African context where we're still striving to create much more democratic systems and accountable systems, I think the removal of that kind of support, I think, is detrimental. And lastly, of course, and I will talk a little about that a little more, I'll talk more about that later, is, of course, the issue of support for health, particularly. And PEPFAR here, and I'll mention South Africa later. Then lastly, the and the positive aspect, I suppose, is that everybody likes a shock. A shock to the system creates opportunities to do things differently. Okay, you're in crisis and you have to do things differently. And I mean, Sachin alluded to the importance of reducing dependency. But this is the point I want to make. What are the options that low-income countries have to create that kind of greater independence, greater autonomy? And I link that to some of the conversations we've already had and we're having around domestic resource mobilization, which is absolutely important. But in low-income countries with very weak tax bases, that becomes really difficult, and non-existent capital markets, for example, becomes really difficult. And to add to that, you have another withdrawal of the US from discussions around taxation and international taxation. And so I think low-income countries and developing countries more broadly will feel the pinch, not just from a decline in aid, which will affect low-income countries more obviously, but also at the same time an unwillingness, a turning back from trying to create a fairer international tax system that will contribute to greater domestic resource mobilization. Let me stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for all those points. I really think this is important. Your comments about the democracy support aspect of development cooperation, also how to use in a positive way the shock moment and many other things. Let's turn to Dr. André de Moyo Sousa. Meo Sousa, sorry, André. André, over to you.
Stefan, and many thanks to you. Greetings to our Nest colleagues and friends. Greetings to all of those who are attending this webinar. I see that we had a very good turnout. So thank you for showing up to listen to us. Let me, as the last speaker, point out that much of what I will say inevitably will already have been said, but I wanted to start out by pointing to the context of this second Trump term regarding U.S. development cooperation. Official development assistance, ODA, as we know it, has been losing relevance relative to other resource flows for a long time. Having said this, as you alluded to earlier, Stefan, Trump's dismantling of USAID clearly is a game changer. It represents a major rupture, and it fits within Trump's approach towards foreign policy. Development cooperation, as we know, is an instrument of foreign policy, and Trump sees it as a way to impose the will of the powerful, instead of having an approach that favors negotiation and cooperation. This is also very much in tune with his opposition to multilateralism and withdrawal from other multilateral forums and institutions, including the World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement. Now, development cooperation has never been entirely about altruism. We know this. There was always some recognition of strategic and economic benefits for donors themselves in giving aid. And this is something that Trump doesn't seem to appreciate, but it is no coincidence that, for instance, the USAID was created by President John Kennedy at the very height of the Cold War. And currently, USAID is arguably one of the best tools of the United States for countering the financial and economic influence from China. Now, Sachin has already pointed out that the US has been for a long time the largest donor of ODA in absolute terms, not as a percentage of GDP, but again, in absolute terms, it is the largest donor. And so suspension of the main agency that provides this aid is very significant in its impact on funding for development projects, and particularly on the most vulnerable and poorest populations around the globe. Important projects initiatives will lose funding. Elizabeth has already mentioned PEPFAR, and we'll doubtless talk more about this, and I'll mention a couple from my own country too in the second round. But the impact will be very significant even if funding is later resumed, right? Because the interruption in these flows in and of itself already causes quite a detrimental impact, particularly for humanitarian aid or cooperation. And here, clearly, the less developed countries will suffer the most, the LDCs. The US provides more than a quarter of all development assistance to Africa, for instance. A research modeling based on the International Futures Forecasting Platform finds that about 5.7 million more Africans will fall below the extreme poverty income level, which is set at US $2.15 in the next year. And actually, this research has already been mentioned, I think, by someone who has been involved in carrying it out in a post here in the chat. And then there's the issue of trust, which also has been alluded to by Elizabeth. Partners will start doubting whether, donors are really reliable and whether the aid or the resources that they provide are sustainable in the long term. And this has a very detrimental effect as well. Is there any positive aspect in all of this? And Professor Lee, I think, has already mentioned it. If there is any, it will be to generate greater self-reliance in the global south. But this will only happen in the long term, right? We cannot expect southern countries to be able to replace these flows that came from USAID in the short or medium term. And there'll be many difficulties involved and obviously also a lot of suffering. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andre, for highlighting many important aspects, including the trust aspect. And I agree, we shouldn't underestimate this. At the beginning, we agreed on 4 questions to you. This was the first round. Let me combine 2 more questions, and then we should try to respond to some questions from the chat. So one question to all of you, and I would like to ask you for brief responses. One is, what kind of specific implications does this US situation have for your respective countries? And the second one, you mentioned already South-South cooperation. What are consequences for South-South cooperation? I think Elizabeth was highlighting this domino effect for DAC countries, OECD countries. Is South-South cooperation part of the domino effect, or is it the opposite, that this is really a momentum for China, for India, for Brazil, for South Africa to increase South-South cooperation? So maybe you can briefly reflect on this, and let's change a bit the order and start with Elizabeth, the consequences for your own countries. I think South Africa was in the media, let's put it this way, over the last couple of weeks. So what are consequences for South Africa? How is South Africa's South-South cooperation approach affected? Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, we are still in the media. One of the best ways of dealing with this, I had thought, was to just fly below the radar, but we haven't. We've lost that. I mean, I think the direct consequences for South Africa are really in the health sector. South Africa is not a huge recipient of USAID. Well, let me put it this way: South Africa's budget, government budget, does not depend on significantly, or to any significant extent, on international assistance, right? As far as USAID is concerned, they are an important contributor via PEPFAR, to South Africa's fight against HIV/AIDS. And remember, South Africa has done, I think, tremendously well in fighting HIV/AIDS probably over the last 15 years. A lot of that can be at the door of sit at the door of USAID. Obviously, it's also the policy environment that changed. I think many of us remember the early 2000s and the position of the government there on AIDS denialism. But PEPFAR contributes, as of last year, 17% to to our work in South Africa on HIV/AIDS, and it's not a lot, it's not, but it's not insignificant. And they operate in particular areas, critical areas. So they do a lot of some funding from there. Does a lot of pays for a lot of the monitoring and testing. So that will be weakened across the spectrum, not just on projects that are funded by USAID. They provide funding for financing for staffing, for some of the running costs. There's also a US-funded HIV vaccine trial with the South African Medical Research Council. We've got some really great scientists, researchers, medical researchers in South Africa, and they're working together with 8 other African countries. That's been terminated. So this is, and at the end of the day, what it affects is lives of people. I mean, there are about 220,000 odd people whose ARV supplies have now been terminated in effect. And some of you may have seen the article in the Financial Times, which really just, was heart-wrenching. And that's the very real impact in a country like South Africa, which has resources, which is fairly, it's an upper middle income country, but with significant, obviously, inequality challenges and health challenges. And that is impacting from day one. Just on South-South cooperation, or you want me to come back to that later? Because I'll come back to that later. I'm going to observe your rules.
Please, 2 or 3 sentences on South-South cooperation, and maybe 1 sentence on AGOA agreement, which needs to be renewed, I think, later in the year. But really, 2 sentences on South-South and 1 on AGOA.
Yeah, so I think, I can't necessarily see some developing countries ramping up their financial contributions to South-South. If I look at my own country, South Africa, we're facing serious fiscal constraints. So I think that's a reality, and I think there are a number of other developing countries that are facing the same. If we look, for example, at China's commitments under FOCAC over the last few years, those have also sort of plateaued, and Professor Lee can say more about that, but the focus there in China is small but beautiful in terms of the way in which some of the the size and scale of the projects that have been undertaken. So I may not be a domino effect, but I think there are very real fiscal constraints. And then I can't remember your second question.
On AGOA.
On AGOA. I think my sense is, and I see that Yaki is also on the call, and I think he'll probably agree with me. I think South Africa will probably not have continued preferential access to the American market in the near future.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and sorry for my unpoliteness. Andre, implications for Brazil, you mentioned it already briefly, and implications for South-South cooperation.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. I'll go straight to the point because we don't have much time. In 2024, USAID disbursed $22.6 million to Brazil. Now, more than half of that, about 14 million, was earmarked for general environmental protection, with the Amazon being a priority. As it is the largest rainforest in the world, and it stores crucial amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. So preserving it is also a major component of Brazil's effort to fight climate change. Now, in Brazil, USAID's largest initiative has been the Amazon Biodiversity Conservation Partnership, which focuses on conserving and improving the livelihoods of indigenous peoples and other forest communities. There has been a shift at USAID in recent years, and Elizabeth has already alluded to this, towards prioritizing funding for grassroots organizations. And here, let me give you one particular example, which is one of the organizations supported by USAID for 7 years now, is the Indigenous Council of Roraima. It operates in 35 areas, includes the Yanomami, which is the oldest indigenous peoples in Brazil, and it covers a territory which is equivalent to that of Greece, about 157,000 square kilometers. Now, funding in these areas is not likely to be resumed under Trump because, as you know, environmental preservation and combating climate change are objectives that have been long opposed by Trump in both his discourse and actions, and he sees them as ideological. So it's not something that's real and worth investing in that. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Andre. quick remark on South-South cooperation?
I think there is an opportunity for South-South cooperation to step in, but it's not obviously going to replace USAID in any way. Actually, Brazil and many other governments of the South see South-South cooperation as complementary to, rather than an alternative to ODA. And this actually is also in the outcome documents of several international forums and agreements. So, you know, there is an opportunity perhaps for China and to a lesser extent India to try to fill in the gap that USAID is leaving. But I don't see South-South cooperation as again, replacing ODA in any way to any extent in the short to medium terms. As regards Brazil's development cooperation, I don't see any major impact. Our government still values this kind of cooperation, even if we have a situation of scarcity of resources at this time.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you. Sachin, same questions to you. I think we, many of us saw this tweet by President Trump on what USAID did in the past in India. I think this was totally fake news, but so how are the effects, implications for India, and what might be implications for India's South-South cooperation?
Thank you, Stefan. In India, at this point, we have a very hot political debate on what assistance came in, what quantum of that. Numbers are differing. People are blaming political leaderships across the board, and it's a bit confusing. But if you see the wider and broader picture, last 2 decades, you find that partnership with the US has delivered on basic health facilities in controlling infectious diseases, HIV/AIDS, but also maternal child health, water supply system, general health, and even in some states in supporting a health policy evolution. So spectrum is rich. Social sector expenditure in India on its own by the central government has gone up by 138%, Stefan. So our own expenditure on our own people has gone up in multiple ways. And for last, this was the 7th year in continuation where government of India has focused maximum expenditure on building capital, the capital sector development. So you find that infrastructure and areas where spillover effects are there, the development strategy that India has adopted in last couple of years, it has minimized the role of the foreign assistance to India. Largely, whatever is coming in with Germany and with Japan, they are the loans that are coming in. So the development strategy where indigenization is extremely important, I think, is something that we need to realize. On the South-South dimension, Stefan, I have 2 points to make. One, as my NEST colleagues are aware, in our publications and in our combined output from our group, we have been articulating for something called as Development Compact, where we say that development assistance grant or loan has to be supplemented by 3 other instrumentalities. Number 1, market access and trade connect of it. Second, human resource development and capacity building. Third, wherever required, technology to be transferred. So all the 5 dimensions form what is called as Development Compact. And this Development Compact is extremely important for the global South countries to leverage a development expansion trajectory that is needed to take that forward. In the chat box, I'm seeing several questions in terms of aid dependence and also on issues, Stefan, which are important in terms of identifying not just USAID collapse, but as Nafis brings out, squeeze that is coming in UK, almost 40% squeeze. So the defense concerns of European countries is also a concern. Incidentally, today morning in Delhi, we had the president of EU with us, Ursula von der Leyen, and with her, we could discuss issues where EU's role would come in, both in triangular cooperation, which India and EU have announced today. Triangular cooperation partnership projects would be supported by European Union and India together. But I think more has to come from China and India together. And my dear friend, Professor Li Xiaoyin, I think it is important for China and India to work together for the global South, as we discussed some time back. And I think it is important for us to create the global public goods. And I think it is important that South, which has been beneficiary of the global South, of the public goods, should take the task forward and create more of these global public goods. I stop here, Stefan. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachin. Very important considerations and interesting to learn about the new triangular initiative by Ursula von der Leyen and her team. And I'm looking forward to Professor Li's response to your new initiative for
Here,
I think you muted. Oh.
Stefan.
Stefan, you are muted. We can't hear you. Stefan, something has gone wrong with you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay.
I was just praising your comments, Sachin, not at least on joint activities between China and India, and looking forward to Professor Li's reflections on it.
Okay, thank you very much.
One moment before I hand over to you, Professor Li. I shared some synthesis of main questions in the chat, so maybe our panelists can have already a look, so you can select one or two for the final round. But Professor Li, your reflections, implications of USAID's new approach to China. Is there any implication? And of course, South Cooperation. Is there any, direct, indirect impact on what China is going to do? Over to you.
Okay, so I think so. Basically, USAID has no program in China. I don't see any significant impact directly when the USAID has been dismantled, both financially and politically, and that is number one. But secondly, I take what happens in USAID as a learning process mostly, and in that aspect, China is the largest South cooperation supporter and provider, and from that perspective, I would say let us just review what my good friend Sachin and other mentioned here. Look at the issue of things the old agenda for aid effectiveness of the Paris Declaration and the Roman document and all the GPTC, all this process, within our development cooperation sector. And we need to see again back the issue of accountability, whose accountability, and how to support what Sachin said, development compact as a South cooperation partner developed. And I would here I would like to emphasize that the approach we call developmental oriented development cooperation approach itself, and also looking for the neutral benefits but demand driven approach, and all those issues we've been talking about for decades now. It is now back on the table, and for us to see after we're going to review what happens to USAID. And from one side is, as Adriel said, and the USAID is largely in line with the US new administration foreign policy line. And secondly, we have to look at its own performance based his historical process, that accountability and politically, particularly on the issue of this downside, what Sachin said, downside of the agency itself. Those actually provide kind of evidence-based lessons which to learn for the social cooperation. So that's something which, lastly, I like to see the social cooperation will not be the replacement of financial terms. The USAID actually left, and that is not purpose, not only in terms of the capacity. And the US is 8 times of the average GDP per person than China, and even much more times than India. So China, India, even China, India, as a good friend to work together, we cannot fit that gap financially. So that is not the point. And secondly, the opportunity I see, not in terms of opportunity, I see the role of social cooperation is not in terms of absolute terms of financial capacity, whether China, India, and Brazil, or any country can work together to fill that gap with EU. That is not the point. But the point I see the role of social cooperation is that we see clearly how we're going to use this opportunity to strengthen and to consolidate our strengths. And our strengths in terms of mutual benefit, in terms of development oriented, and all this learning, and those things I would say we have to work together. And India and China, we would work together, in this aspect to strengthen the power of the global south. And in that aspect, I see the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Really interesting to learn today that we might see a closer collaboration between India and China on development topics. But one concrete, direct, additional question, Professor Lee. Are we going to see an increase of China-South-South cooperation because of this new situation or not?
I think basically, if you look at the FOCAC and all times meeting, and then we have the vision of this community of shared future, and we have a development initiative, global development initiative, and the global security initiative. So those things, and we have also set up the mechanisms in the UN level. So China has been always committed to increase and improve its commitment. And on the time, disregard the USAID's collapse. So I would say this China would really carefully look at the situation and work together with our partners in the future, particularly with African partners and other partners in the future, to see how China could play increasingly important role in the global development. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee. So final round now. I would encourage you just to try to address one question from the chat. I will give to you 90 seconds. After 90 seconds, you will hear my loud timer. Then it's over. If you wish, you can say few words if we need to have some kind of new momentum for international aid or development cooperation governance. So do we need to have a new place where we meet and discuss between different actors? But feel free to choose any question from the chat. Again, 90 seconds and it's over. And Andre, we start with you.
I will address the civil society, human rights, political rights, and ODA by USAID to the global south. And I think this touches on a very important point. It's not just about financial resources and the amount of the financial resources that are being provided. It is also about how it's being channeled and the quality of the aid being given. And again, USAID has many problems. It does, like Professor Lee said in his initial remarks, it does have a political strategic component. And, other countries in my region, such as Peru and even Colombia, see the dismantling of USAID as something that will not have a major impact because it did not really do much good beforehand. But having said that, it also has favored grassroots organizations. And I think Elizabeth made this point. And so to the extent that we no longer have USAID, and to the extent that it's replaced by Chinese aid, we will have a very different kind of development cooperation, right? China aid tends to favor large projects, infrastructural projects, and not so much this grassroots mobilization, and tends to work with governments more as well. So I think this is an important point. And the other, I may, in the second that I have remaining, many people have posted that other DAC donors might follow suit, and they have. The UK has announced a 40% cut in its ODA. Germany, which is the second largest donor after this, even though it's six times less than the US, also might be diverting resources for security purposes rather than global development. So this is also worrisome, and I'll leave it at that. Many thanks again. I can't hear you, Stefan.
Sorry, thank you, Andre. Professor Lee, your final conclusions, 90 seconds, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very quickly, I'd like to address the question that what potential of the global south for the gap, the USAID. So I again like to re-emphasize the point here is that global the point is not going to ask and expect global south to look for the financial amount to feed the gap, but rather to look at the way how the global south to work together and to create its own local resources, and particularly looking for how promote industrialization development and generate sufficient income, sufficient tax, and to be collected, essentially. So that from that point of view, I would say global south has great potential, not only under the situation of USAID's collapse, but also in the long-term run. That is the way how global south could maintain sustainable development in the future. Thank you very much for this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. Elizabeth, over to you. Your 90 seconds.
So I'm going to answer in a different way, and I'm going to say that what I think we need to focus on, and I say that sort of sitting here in Cape Town after the G20 finance ministers meetings and so on, is how do we make sure in the short term that other mechanisms that we have in place globally are not further jeopardized by what has happened in the last month. I think the focus of today's discussion was on the global south, and I think that is important. We as countries in the developing world really also have to think about how we reduce our dependency, increase self-reliance. But as I said, for some countries, that's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen in the short term. And this is the LDCs, and I think many people have alluded to that already. But what we also need, we need to be smart. If we're looking at the finance dimension, we really need to be smarter about how we use the funds, but also very importantly, and this is a point also for developing countries, and I say that sort of coming from the African continent, we also need to make sure that the way in which the finances are allocated are spent wisely and without corruption. And that's important, and that's something we also have to do on our side, because I think the resources are going to be much scarcer. There's not going to be much, and we need to think about coalitions of the willing. Oh, there we go. So just the last point, really, there are opportunities to partner across historical divides, and I think we need to look at what these opportunities can be, and in what sectors and on what issues.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Sachin, over to you. Your 90 seconds.
Stefan, I would just be very brief. I just want to thank our all panelists here and also the participants. And I just want to mention that a recording of our conversation would be made available, and it would be on Nest website. It would also be shared with all the participants. So it's a dialogue which is in continuation. There cannot be any quick closing of this, but just to mention that the issues which have come up in the chat box where several people have asked for recording and reference, so I want to answer that, and I want to say that it would be made available by the Nest Secretariat. So we would do that. The second point that Stefan, I want to mention is in terms of people who are coming out from USAID, as has just been very rightly observed by Catherine, is in terms of people who have left USAID are a good resource base for global development system, and we should not let that talent go away. We should see how development forces, development thinking, institutional frameworks can come together and see what can be done collectively better and for a secured world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sachin. I'm not going to draw many conclusions, just few highlights I take away from our discussion today. One is this reflection on democracy support for civil society organizations, and the complexity of this topic. And I think this is not an easy discussion, but good you were highlighting to it. This potential new collaboration between India and China on development cooperation, very interesting to reflect on it. We didn't mention the Finance for Development conference. It was also part of the chat, but it will be important to learn, is this an opportunity we can already rethink development finance, or is it we are still flashed and shocked because what is going on, and it will be a lost opportunity. I mean, it's also a bit up to us. And my last conclusion, I think, this kind of real dialogue, what we had in China, what we have today here in the webinar, is something what we need more often. Yeah, real dialogue to find common ground, etc. So I really appreciate that Nest members were, proposing this webinar approach. Let me also thank the great outcome of this webinar. We had more than 420 participants, maybe even more. We have a very interesting chat. I saw many great friends and colleagues from around the world. I would love to mention all of them, so greetings to all of you. But finally, let me just thank Elizabeth, Sachin, Andre, Xiao Yun for your great collaboration. Really very inspiring and also to some extent fun in a way difficult time. So thank you so much. With this, have a great weekend wherever you are, and hope to see you soon again. All the best to you and to our audience. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you
Bye.
for your moderation.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.